The Fate of Humanity by band_n_c subreddit. When Anthony Willis pulled up to the Salford Inn, he had to check his map to make sure that he was at the right place, and according to the map, he was. When his friend told him that the place looked a little old-fashioned, he thought that maybe it would look Victorian, or perhaps even colonial, but certainly not something that looked like he jumped straight out of a grim fairy tale. The dirty old cottage had a roof thatched with soiled and weedy hay, with yellowish-brown walls that had been clearly white at some point in the past. These scratched and dented walls were supported by gnarled old beams of wood, bent and twisted by the cold winds of time. The only sign of life was the flickering glow of a fireplace, struggling to get past the grimy old windows on the ground floor. Parked on a patch of thin yellowed grass parallel to the side of the building, Anthony couldn't help but admire the sleepy little valley that stretched out below the inn. The snow-blanketed little vale was packed with frosted trees that had snug little cabins nestled throughout it. It was certainly a pleasant break in Anthony's mind from the expanding shanty towns and winding bread lines from back home. Jumping out of the old squeaky Ford, Anthony made for the front door of the decrepit old inn, desperate to get inside where he'd hopefully escape the frigid cold that he'd been driving in for 3 miserable hours. To his immense pleasure, a blast of warm air tinted with ham practically punched him in the face when he opened the door. The front door opened into a narrow little hallway that turned left into what Anthony presumed to be the bar and dining area, though he couldn't see it from the front doorway. On the opposite side of the hall from the door was a closed wooden door. On the far wall, across from Anthony, was a thin, middle-aged woman in a gray stained dress who was fixing a loose candle bracket. Upon hearing the entrance of a new customer, she turned a tan, weather-worn face aged from a lifetime of struggle and work towards Anthony. "Looking for a room or just a bite to eat?" "A bit of dinner would be great, ma'am," Anthony replied with a polite grin as he hung up his coat and hat. "My husband's the cook and bartender around here, so you'll have to talk to him about that. I just keep the place and kept up, not caving in on it itself." She paused a moment. "My name's Sandra Salford, if you need anything," she added. "Anthony Willis," he replied politely. She fiddled with the candle bracket for a moment longer, and when she seemed finally satisfied with her work, she turned fully towards him. "I had a cousin named Anthony," she murmured, with a sad look in her eyes. "Good kid, too. Got killed in the war. Was shot by a German officer in Belgium." I'm very sorry to hear that, Miss Salford." "Yes, well, it sure did hit us hard, didn't it?" "Yeah, it sure did. I had a friend who fought over in the trenches. Never was the same after that." Did you ever fight in the war?" Sandra asked hesitantly. "No," he answered with a chest-pounding cough. "Heart problems." Anyways, it was good meeting you, Anthony. My husband Sinclair is around here somewhere. Just make yourself comfortable, okay?" The first thing Anthony noticed about the bar and dining area was that it was unexpectedly cozy. Just based on the appearance of the building from the outside, you never would have expected the rosy glow of the windows as they caught the sun's last few minutes of wakefulness, nor would anyone have expected the warm, earthy tones that tinted the place, softened by the light of the roaring flames in the fireplace and the flickering candles. No, if judging by the outside of the Salford Inn, the inside should have been cold, drab, and dreary. Over by the fireplace, Anthony spied a table of men listening intently to a bearded, burly man animatedly telling a story. "And I said, but you've got to shove that sucker in there good, or it'll just pop right out again," he exclaimed amidst a roar of hearty chuckles and guffles. Fresh face," the man boomed, taking notice of the confused and slightly concerned man standing in the doorway. The jokester was a barrel-chested, stocky man who wasn't tall, but not quite short either. His chocolate brown hair was thick and messy, and his bristling beard even thicker and messier. "Here, pull up a chair. What's your name, my friend?" he asked courteously. "Anthony. Anthony Willis." "Well, Anthony Willis, welcome to the Salford Inn. My name's Sinclair Salford, and I reckon you'll be wanting a pint of something, right?" "That'd be great, Mr. Salford. You got any cider?" "Hardest damn cider there is, my friend. And please, call me Sinclair. Oh, and got some potatoes just cooking up some ham, too, if you want any." "If you could, please," Anthony said as he took an empty seat opposite from Sinclair. "Come right up," he affirmed, striding back into the kitchen behind the bar. "So," the man to Anthony's right said after a moment, "what brings a city man like yourself all the way out here in the boonies?" He sounded slightly suspicious, as if Anthony's presence suggested illicit activities. "Oh, my family lives on the other side of the mountains, and I said that I'd be here for Thanksgiving tomorrow. And my friend told me that there was a shortcut that trailed from the main road up ahead." "Oh, sure there is," a haggard-looking man grumbled from across the table, taking a massive swig from his mug. "But you're better off taking a few hours to take the long way, though. That shortcut's dangerous, it is." "Well, I can't take but a few more hours, because it'll be a few more hours already once I get there, through these mountains. I'm already cutting it close as it is." "Then what the fucking hell are you doing stopping off here for?" exclaimed the small fellow to Anthony's left. Anthony shrugged and said, "I'm hungry and it's been cold." The little man shook his head in mild disbelief. "Besides," Anthony continued, "what's so bad about this shortcut anyways?" "Well, for one," the man to his right answered, "people go missing up there all the time, and not once has anybody who's disappeared up there ever been found. No, never once. Plus," an old gentleman in black turtleneck added, "this time of year, the whole path's all iced up, and you'll be going through some rough mountainside with a steep drop to your right, almost the whole way fucking through." "First pint's on the house," a booming voice bellowed in Anthony's ear, as a large, hairy fist came crashing down in front of him with a sloppy mug of hard cider, followed by a mountain of steaming mashed potatoes and great slabs of ham. Thanks, Mr. Salford," Anthony said, amazed by the enormous pile of food in front of him. Yeah, don't worry about it. Now get the hell out of my seat," he barked at a small fat man with a dottish grin on his face, whose shiny bald head looked a little bit like a pale pink sausage. "What's keeping your seat warm for you, Mr. Salford?" Yeah, sure you were, Chucklehead. Now get the hell up." Fittingly enough, Chucklehead then gave out a short burst of shrill, girlish giggles before getting up. Drunk and pissy. He was always pissy when he was drunk and alone. Anthony Willis was seriously regretting drinking all those pints of cider, and was cursing himself for allowing himself to lose track of time like that. He glanced at his watch and cursed profusely under his breath when he saw that he was already 10 o'clock. Better be one hell of a shortcut, he thought to himself bitterly. The going was excruciatingly slow, the dirt road was windy and icy, and the nearly hidden path that branched off to become the shortcut was even windier and icier. Though he hadn't yet reached the pass, the road was already steep, with a nasty drop into the valley on the path's right. One false move, and he'd be sent tumbling down into the valley below. His blurred and dizzy vision didn't do much to help his nerves either. Anthony's original estimation of taking about 10 minutes to reach the pass had been agonizingly stretched to 45. Looking behind him, the Salford Inn seemed pathetically close behind. What in the hell was I thinking, staying so goddamn long? It was nearly midnight now, and Anthony was starting to panic. Snow had begun to fall steadily, and his windshield kept jamming up. At this rate, he wouldn't get through the mountains until nearly dawn, and he still had a 5-hour drive after that. Good thing he thought to bring gas cans with him, or else he really would be royally fucked. The snow was picking up hard, and so was the wind. His car had no heating system, so even though Anthony was wearing several layers of clothing, he could feel every drop in temperature, especially in his fingers and toes, which felt as though they might snap off any second now. Visibly was quickly dropping too. To Anthony's left was sheer rock face. To his right was a steep drop of several hundred feet, and in front of him he could see that about 10 feet of path before the whirlwind of snow blocked his field of vision. Pretty soon he could only see about 5 feet in front of the car. At the point when he could no longer see in any direction at all, Anthony cried "horse shit" and called it quits. There was no way in hell he could drive in snow like this. However, right as he was about to put his foot on the brakes, the car lurched downwards. Though not so steeply for Anthony to think that he'd gone over the side. This would be fine if there wasn't just one problem. The path was glazed with so much ice that the brakes were rendered completely useless against the car's rapid acceleration. "Fucking Christ!" he roared at the windshield, slamming on the brakes repeatedly to no avail. Pounding his fist on the horn didn't seem to do much either, but at least it felt good. Out of nowhere, the car smashed into a monstrously huge boulder that was blocking the path. The car hit the boulder at such an angle that the car was spinning counterclockwise off the road, tumbling down, down, down. He awoke to the gentle touch of a snowflake on his cheek. At first, when he found that he couldn't see anything, Anthony thought that he was blind, but then realized that he was just looking up at the night sky. Well, at least that blizzard's let up, he thought to himself, with a vague satisfaction, hazily admiring the way the snowflakes were dancing lazily through the air. As he gathered his wits about him, his head hurt an awful lot. He slowly realized that he was still in the car, which was on its side, half covered in snow, looking up through a broken window, numb from the cold. His first few attempts to crawl out head first through the window were unsuccessful, but eventually, with a humongous effort, he managed to flop into the snow outside. He laid there, eyes closed, enjoying the numbness he felt. It felt good to just be lay there. Eventually, he mustered up the will and energy to lift up his head. Just steep, rocky mountainside. Shit, he thought, filling with dread as he scanned the area to his left. All he could see was more mountainside and wreckage from cars and buggies. He turned over into his back so that he could look behind him, just a cliff towering over him. He sighed, watching the snow drift lazily in the harsh light of the car's right headlight that somehow hadn't broken in the fall. He let his eyes follow the beam of light to his right and gasped at what he saw. It was a tree. It was a tree Anthony'd never seen the likes of before. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted like a rope, with roots sprawling out from the base in all directions, crawling over rocks that were mysteriously free of snow, and then diving back in again. The thing that made the tree truly remarkable, though, were the patches on the bark that had a deep orange glow, as if light were passing through skin. He stumbled stiffly towards the tree, and up close Anthony could see the veins and arteries line the inside of the skin, past which were pulsating and throbbing organs. "What the hell is this?" he whispered to himself in horrified wonder. Something poked his leg. Looking down, Anthony saw that, to his horror, a long, thin tentacle of slimy pink flesh that was extended from the end of a root was slowly wrapping itself around the bottom of his left leg. He yelped and kicked his leg clumsily, but the tentacle tightened with the force of a boa constrictor and yanked Anthony off his feet. Others followed suit, incapacitating him by wrapping their slimy pink bodies around his arms and other leg. While he lay there, struggling uselessly against the tree's fleshly tentacles, one appeared before his face. A hole opened up at the end of it, out of which squirmed hundreds of little electric blue threads. Anthony screamed as if the very gates of hell had opened up. Immediately he knew that it was a huge mistake, for right then the wriggling blue thread shot out of the hollow tube as one and plummeted down his throat and into his lungs. The other tentacles that opened up as well, and the thread squirmed into his ears, nose, and even through the spaces around his eyes and directly into his brain. He could feel them inside of groping his organs and pulling him headfirst into one giant, hollow root. It was warm inside of the root. It was dark, warm, and Anthony was scared shitless. Though the warm, nebulous darkness seemed to last an eternity, Anthony eventually found himself being pulled into a skin-tight sack that seemed to burn his skin. And past his raw, tearful eyes, he could see in the deep orange glow other throbbing, twitching organs at work. And suddenly Anthony had a grim realization. He was in the tree's stomach, being digested alive, and he knew that his life was over. This was the end. But then the tree sent images of the Great War into Anthony's brain, using the bright blue threads. His head was a whirlwind of trenches in Europe, dogfights, propaganda, and U-boats. Some images he'd seen before in newspapers, while others he'd never seen before. The threads wriggled deeper into his brain, and more scenes from the war flashed before his eyes of air raids and chlorine gas. Now the war was over, and people were cheering in the streets. Then he saw the Palmer raids and labor strikes. Prohibition began. Germany was in deep depression with practically useless money. The Soviet Union was established. Mussolini was gaining power in Italy. Lenin was dead. Anthony knew that he was approached this present day because Herbert Hoover was elected president, after which the stock market plummeted. People were losing everything they had, many of whom were jumping out of buildings, banks were failing, shanty towns and bread lines were rampant, and children lived on the backs of trains. Almost all of the Midwest was nothing but a vast ocean of dust and dirt clouds. It was at this point that the tree began to show him things that had never occurred during Anthony's lifetime. Things that hadn't happened yet. People, thousands of people known as the Bonus Army, were marching the Capitol, and President Hoover sent infantrymen to go and implement tear gas on them. Then there was a new face in the Oval Office, a face of hope, speaking of a new deal to pull America back out of its depression. But back in Germany, there was a different face, one that filled Anthony with dread. But like Franklin Roosevelt, Adolf Hitler too wanted to pull his country out of a devastating depression. But unlike Roosevelt, his philosophy was built upon racism and hate. He wanted to build an empire for the so-called master race. Meanwhile, south of Germany, Italy was busy invading Ethiopia, while to the west, Spain had erupted into civil war. Over in Asia, Japan was pushing hard to expand their empire, which Germany was also now doing, pushing into Czechoslovakia and Poland. And Anthony watched in horror as the blitzkrieg unfurled before his tearful eyes. Towards the north, Stalin was pushed into Finland, and Hitler into Norway and Luxembourg. Eventually, they seized France and used this position to barrage London with bombs night and day. Back in Poland, Hitler was herding people into camps. He imprisoned not only Jews, but also gypsies, homosexuals, communists, socialists, the handicapped. Anthony watched in mute horror as they were starved, beaten, tortured, shot, burned, and gassed. In America, a naval base in Hawaii was suddenly attacked by the Japanese, thus thrusting America into the war at last. As a result, however, Japanese Americans were forcibly moved into internment camps for no good reason, and Anthony was astonished that his own country would do such a thing. Meanwhile, in China, tensions were mounting between nationalists and communists. Blood, death, and genocide was all Anthony saw for the remainder of the war, until he saw America set a plume of fire blooming out like a fungus over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, effectively ending the war. However, the victory for the Allies came at a price, the price of thousands of innocent lives, with the survivors looking like they'd be better off dead. In Germany, tensions were high and blockades were being set up in Berlin. A few years later, civil war erupted in Korea, in which the U.S. decided to butt in. Eventually, the Civil War reached a stalemate with the communists, after which the country was split into North and South Korea. Back home, people were drenched in a plague of paranoia and fear of communism. A man named McCarthy was taking advantage of this, making ridiculous accusations against people, highly reminiscent of the Salem witch trials. Meanwhile, all across the country, monetized suburbs were proliferating like some sort of infection of mediocrity. Tsunamis of advertisements and commercials were flooding Anthony's brain, disorienting and dizzying him. In between the relentless advertisements and commercials, Anthony had yet more visions of the future. He saw the Bay of Pigs, the construction of the Berlin Wall, a bus in Alabama full of protesting African Americans being attacked, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy assassination. In Birmingham, he saw African Americans beaten, attacked by dogs, and sprayed with fire hoses because of the color of their skin. All over the country, people were protesting the abuse of African Americans, and he even witnessed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Finally, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and the Voting Rights Act passed the next year. About this time, things began to get a little fuzzier and less detailed, as though the farther into the future the tree's visions went, the harder it was for it to see with as much detail. Nonetheless, Anthony still had plenty enough to figure out what was going on in the world. In Vietnam, the U.S. was butting in to squash the communist Viet Cong. Anthony watched in horror as the U.S. military doused villages in napalm and sprayed the countryside with Agent Orange. In protest, monks set themselves on fire in the war-torn country, while back at home America's youth was in an uproar against the war. After the war finally ended, things began to speed up and get hazy, eventually slowing enough for him to see the Gulf War, with the CIA training terrorists to further their cause. Then, on September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists flew planes into the Pentagon and World Trade Center, killing hundreds in the process. Almost immediately afterwards, the president announced a war on terror, though instead of going directly after the ones responsible, the U.S. military decided to invade Iraq first and overthrow their government. Things began again to get fuzzy, but Anthony could still see the decline of Al-Qaeda and the rise of ISIS. Eventually, ISIS somehow managed to take over the entire Middle East and were recruiting followers by the thousands. In 2030, they nuked the U.S. president's hometown of Winston, and a couple of years later they released a biologically engineered flesh-eating bacteria that caused zombie-like symptoms and was enriched by the same kind of radiation that was emitted by cell phone towers. In the resulting chaos, and by withholding the cure, they successfully pushed their way into mainland Europe and eventually the British Isles. Eventually the cure was stolen and the pandemic was over, but the Islamic State was left unchallenged for nearly 90 years before it began to fall due to widespread rebellions. During the years between the oceans, animal population was devastated by pollution and overfishing, and the ice caps melted, resulting in massive flooding all over the world's coastlines. Over 400 years later, NASA discovered a planet nearly identical to Earth in gravity, temperature, atmosphere, and even in the lengths of days and years. NASA wanted to announce this exciting new planet named Discovery to the public, but the U.S. military made them keep it a secret for the time being. A few decades later, the military developed almost instantaneous space travel using artificially created wormholes. They then used this to secretly set up research facilities on Discovery to conduct Nazi-like experiments. In the 2700s, despite measures already taken, overpopulation was reaching a crisis on Earth, and many countries conducted mass sterilization, though Anthony watched in repulsion as the more radical nations conducted mass slaughter against the poor. The wealthy, however, had underground colonies built on Mars so that they would escape the discomfort of Earth. The lower class, meanwhile, were stuck in concentrated ghettos and internment camps to make more room for the middle class. Several decades later, a devastating plague broke out on Earth that ended up leaving 5 billion left, just 1/20th of the population before. Almost a century later, a group of people escaped discovery and exposed the horrors being conducted there. After colossal public outcry, the prisoners of discovery were freed, though they were still heavily oppressed, and the experiments continued even heavier secrecy. More than 200 years later, the people of Discovery led an armed rebellion, and the military ultimately nuked most of Discovery and entirely abandoned the forsaken planet. It was at this point that the tree seemed to be approaching its limit. Life grew back on Discovery. Mars fell into a dark age, and the last thing Anthony saw was Mars being blown up remotely by an underestimated military on Discovery thousands of years later, the pieces of which collided into Earth, effectively destroying it as well. The vision's now over, so too was the life of Anthony Willis. The tree's purpose now complete, it digested the unfortunate man's body, taking only nutrients it needed and pouring the rest back into the earth around it.